Dan Wang, at long last, makes his solo ChinaTalk debut. We're here to discuss and celebrate his first book, Breakneck. Dan Wang, welcome to ChinaTalk.
Jordan, it's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful space. Thank you for having Breakneck right here. I think even more importantly, we have decided to have the Norton translation of the Torah right here beside us. This is translated by Robert Alter, a totally landmark work. We have right here a super important work that I read as preparation for getting through the Shanghai lockdown in 2022. We share the same publishers, and so I think it is really good that we have the Torah and Breakneck right here featured in your video.
So what can the Bible tell us about engineers versus lawyers, modern China, Xi Jinping? You start us off.
Something I wonder about is, thinking less about the Old Testament, but the New Testament, and thinking about the Catholic Church in particular. I think that the Catholic Church and the Communist Party are very alike organizations, and it might be the case, I wonder, if the CCP and the Catholic Church will be enduring organizations that we will still find around 100 years from now, maybe even 500 years from now. Now, that's kind of no accident that the CCP resembles the Catholic Church, in part because, according to Carrie Brown, the Communist Party has spent an immense amount of effort trying to understand the Catholic Church. And I think the Communist Party is not simply the Catholic Church. I understand the Communist Party to be a cross between the Catholic Party as well as the Sicilian Mafia, in which there is this incredible sense of omerta, and there is a very strong sense that, you can't only be thugs. One has to build a church. One has to have ideology. And so what we have is a very powerful Catholic Church in China that also has the omerta, and that also has the gangsterism.
That's awesome. So one of the things I most admire about this book is it talks and looks forward multiple decades in a way that I get incredibly bored by when the likes of a Peter Zehan do it, talking about, demography, destiny, or geography. But the way you sort of incorporate a lot of different data points and pieces of context that you've absorbed over your years on this planet give it some weight and heft that I do want to take very seriously. However, yes. The thing that I am worried you did too much is index on Xi and the Xi era, which at some point is going to end. And I think a lot of the kind of forward-looking dot projections that you have on the Chinese side in particular are to some degree prefaced on whatever comes after Xi kind of looking like what Xi was. So over to you, Dan. How do you think about that issue?
It's interesting that you start out by saying that I may be over-indexed on Xi, because I think one strain of criticism I've seen is that maybe I'm under-indexed on Xi, because in my central thesis of the engineering state, one can quibble whether Xi is really an engineer. On the one hand, he is, because he had a degree in chemical engineering from Tsinghua, but then he also had a doctorate in Marxist economics, I believe, also from Tsinghua. And so there's been some debate about whether Xi is an engineer in the hydraulic mold set by Hu Jintao. I think that it is very valid to consider that the China of the future will not look like China of the present. In fact, we can guarantee it. But I have no confidence about what China of the future will look like in a post-Xi world. Now, it could be the case that Xi Jinping represents someone like Chun Doo-han, South Korea's dictator, who intensified Park Chung-hee's rule and triggered disaster as a result. Maybe someone who comes after Xi is an intensification of Xi in comprehensive aspects. Maybe it is someone who looks quite different, but given that we, I think, have to draw the lines forward to some extent from what we have right now, I am reluctant to assign a big rupture in China's political traditions based on this idea that whoever replaces Xi might not end up quite looking like him.
Yeah, I guess the story you index on from the late 70s and the 80s, which is the time in CCP history, at least, where you see more of the vibrancy, more even kind of lawyerly energy coming into the party. You focused on the most, I don't know, horrific, repressive arc of that, which was the, one-child policy and all of the, state invasion and suppression that was required to execute that. But there are other stories you can tell about the late 70s and 80s, which, speak to a lot of the challenges that you kind of project onto China, see in China today and project into China in the future. This idea of, a society that can create cultural goods that are interesting, party leadership which distrusts the people, more bottom up kind of political innovation, economic innovation than something that the state being okay or more understanding than maybe it is today of that. So yeah, how do you read that history, that time of history beyond the universe that the one-child policy created?
I think that it is certainly the case that the 1980s were China's most interesting decade, and maybe it is understudied and under-theorized. As you note, I spend quite a bit of time thinking about the one-child policy, which I didn't quite, I think, grasp how brutal was its enforcement, in part because it's been a while ago. This is before the peak of the enforcement happened in the early 80s, and then another wave in the late 90s, and this is before both of our lifetimes. And I think in part because a lot of the one-child policy enforcement focused mostly in the rural areas, and we don't have so many rural perspectives relative to elite urban perspectives. I think that was one of the big stories of the 1980s, but you're right, there were many other big stories. I think the 1980s is cited by many people, especially of my parents' generation, in which every question could have been asked inside Chinese society, inside the Communist Party. This was kind of the decade of rock and roll. This was kind of the decade of people really believing that China will have some degree of political liberalization. And those questions kept persisting and might even have had a resolution that was different from how we know it resolved most dramatically in June of 1989, when the forces of liberalism were comprehensively crushed and the party took a pretty different direction. And so I think that we could draw a different line from the 1980s, and maybe we should draw that different line. But I think given that it ended with a really dramatic act of political repression, and given that we had the conservatives, reform conservatives perhaps, have the upper hand represented by Deng Xiaoping as well as Li Qiang, then maybe it is the case that I think the story is still more about the politics than the creativity.
Yeah. You have these two lines, which the inverse of which feels like really captured the 1980s. Someone you met in Chiang Mai who left China told you China feels like and this is speaking about China contemporary, China feels like a space in which the ceiling keeps getting lower. To stay means that we have to walk around with our heads lowered and our backs hunched. And you also write that after 6 years in China, I miss pluralism. It's wonderful for me to be in America now in a society made up of many voices, not only an official register meant to speak over all the rest. And I think those two, the flip side of them, captures some spirit of what the 80s were like. And, I buy your line that, one side has won and they've been winning and winning and winning mostly for the past 40 plus years. But, even with the white paper movement, I mean, there's still undercurrents, which you would think could, which seem to me to be impossible to be disappeared.
Absolutely. And I think the currents are always out there. And this is part of what makes people like Ian Johnson's work really interesting, that when he documents something like Mao's quote that a single spark could produce a prairie fire, he's absolutely right. And I think it has become really difficult to comprehensively and decisively take out the forces of, call it, creativity, let's say, that desire a different future. And I think that is always there, and that is always worth supporting.
Just as an aside, I read this book, or I went into this book thinking, like, you wouldn't tell me a lot of, like, I would get your takes, but you wouldn't tell me a lot of new things. And the one-child policy in particular was the beat that I had not fully internalized, just sort of like the magnitude and the personal horror that was attached to what that meant for tens of millions of people. And this kind of goes to say why everyone should read the book and not just listen to all the podcasts that Dan's going to be on over the next few weeks, because it is a book which is written for a mass market audience, but it is also something that I truly think every single listener of ChinaTalk is going to derive something new, unique, and insightful from, whether it's from your historical work, whether it's from the more memoir-y stuff, whether it's from the travel logs, or just like, I don't know, your big thoughts. It's a real remarkable achievement, and I want to congratulate you on it.
Thank you, Jordan. That's very kind for you to pick up that I've had different registers. And also, I think you picked up exactly that. My favorite chapter to write was, unexpectedly to me, also the one-child policy, because I did not really expect that the emotional arc of the one-child policy still produces a lot of anger in people, that a lot of normally temperate people in China would be driven to a froth of rage when they remember that era. And I think we all know a lot about zero COVID, which is also one of the social engineering projects that I write about. But one-child policy is understudied and perhaps under-theorized.
Yeah, and I think it's just like, this is the most striking, because we have a lot of, folks from the mainland like yourself who moved here, and there are a lot of Chinese Americans too, and Chinese Americans have siblings, and yes. Mainlanders who've moved here over the past 30 years basically don't. And it's just such a wild thing to have an entire generation for whom, I mean, literally all of human history, like, you have TFR above 2, and for it to go to not that in such a kind of intrusive and brutal way, not in like a slow fade you're seeing in South Korea or whatever. It's really heart-wrenching.
I had a really interesting conversation with someone who read that chapter recently, who was adopted himself in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, and we are of similar ages. And one of the things he told me when he read my chapter was that when he was growing up, basically in the late 80s and early 90s, he would sometimes go to these gatherings with other adopted children. And a majority of the adopted children that you could find in the US Pacific Northwest were Chinese girls. And so this is another one of these things that, unless you have some experience here, this is much less vivid than than you might imagine.
Yeah, it's just like the ghosts of all these, lives that weren't lived. I mean, what was it? Something like 40 million.
That's the best estimates. Right now, we still don't have a really comprehensive and that's the best estimate. Right now, we still don't have a really good consensual estimate of exactly how many lives the one-child policy had cost, in part because the data is a little bit sketchy and it is a little bit difficult to draw these sort of hypotheticals. According to the Communist Party, the state propaganda is that the one-child policy averted something like 400 million births, and that seems to be subject to a lot of strange extrapolation that not all demographers accept. There's some demographers who say that the one-child policy was pure brutality without substantially affecting the birth rate in China. And so even on this pretty crucial period, and I acknowledge this in my book, it has become a little bit difficult to figure out exactly how many births the one-child policy era averted. But based on some of the more accepted scholarly estimates, there are 40 million Chinese girls because the femicide produced by one-child policy really was very intense, in which families were forced to keep boys and forced to discard their little baby infant girls.
Um, I don't know if I have a transition for that. I don't know. It makes me think of the Bible, man. It's just like, um, I don't know. So I have a new 1-year-old, which you were just holding for a
Yes.
little while, and sort of reading that chapter in the context of now being the parent of someone, and you tell these like truly horrific, stories which you only give 2 paragraphs about some bureaucrat who was the quote unquote worst performing when it came to births, and then decided we're not having births for a month. And so there were abortions on the delivery table. And it's it felt like a cliche where everyone's like, oh, like you're gonna, the way you read the news and the way you see the world is going to change when you have a child. And I really think that chapter maybe was one of the first times where I like experienced a piece of history or some literature where it just sat with me in a different way. So I don't know if I want to thank you for that, but
I thank you, Jordan, for letting me hold an extremely cute 1-year-old. And I thank you for sharing that perspective. Part of what made this chapter difficult to write was that my wife suffered a miscarriage, coincidentally, just as over the course of my writing this chapter. And to think that it was a matter of state policy to have conducted over 300 million abortions, which is the official statistics from the National Health Commission, as well as many forced sterilizations, the brutality meted out against overwhelmingly female bodies. That was a challenge to think about, to try to place myself back in the 80s.
We're just going to do a hard pivot. So methods of knowing. You have worked a similar job to I had, kind of covering Chinese policy at a very close, full-time clip. You've traveled around, you've read a ton, you slowed down and hung out in Michigan, looked at a pretty view, and wrote a book. And you go, I think, in this book as well at the level, or let's just do the learning side. I don't know I guess the answer is all of the above, right? Because it's your revealed preference. But like, how do those? What are the limits of those different methods of exploring the world that you've done that ended up creating Breakneck?
I think there is never enough information and sourcing about anything to satisfy even the most niche, specific question. And I think this is one of the things one knows as an analyst or a researcher. No matter how narrowly you try to define your research task, you will find that the literature is endless. There's a lot of people who have covered this, and yet what they have is also totally incomplete. And I didn't try so hard to be very formalist, I think, in my study of China. One could have spent a lot of time thinking about just everything that Xi Jinping said. One could simply travel around the country and just talk to people and experience how life is different between, say, Shenzhen and Guizhou. One could hang out mostly in Shanghai and try to be an analyst and figure out data and talk to business executives. And I decided that I was going to do all of the above, that I was going to read every speech published in Qiushi, Seeking Truth, the party's main theory magazine. I was going to read some of the necessary documents, but I wasn't going to read every issue of People's Daily. That would be madness. And thank you to a lot of people who do this sort of work. Thank you for doing God's work. Not really quite for me, but I'm glad that there are people there synthesizing all of this excellent work. I decided that I had to spend quite a bit of time traveling around the country to really physically see some of the ways in which Guizhou is improving through the build out of better airports, better train stations, as well as bigger bridges. And I decided that I had to spend some time talking to folks in Beijing, talking to folks in Shanghai, the capital, more about politics, the business center, more about how executives are thinking about the world. And I did my best to try to be synthetic and not let any single perspective override the others, but just to be as synthetic and accretive as possible to try to produce a mix, however it ends up.
So not to glaze you too much, many people can choose to spend their time spreading their bets across different modalities of knowledge, and the ability for you to sort of abstract a way to get to the aphorisms and the provocations and also be able to go kind of like levels down and levels up, I think what makes you a unique mind. But I'm going to stop giving you too many compliments.
Jordan, this is your show. You can give me all the compliments you need to. I think the most important thing is to tread softly and tread lightly. And sometimes you need to dip a little bit deeper into a particular pond. But otherwise, maybe you should just be out and figure out new ways to explore different projects.
Maybe this is just me talking about myself, and that like I feel like going deeper and narrower, it's easier to be useful and interesting versus trying to do the big synthetic thing that you did with this book is a higher degree of difficulty because like the things you are talking about are, you can't, like you're saying, oh, you can never grasp any little thing, like, but you can get closer to grasping a little thing than maybe you can grasping China and America in one book, right? So I don't know. I guess my takeaway was like, I think I'm doing in the long scope of ChinaTalk, trying to think over a multi-decade horizon when it comes to this thing. But like you showed me what it actually means to do that in this book, and so or you showed me a different way of going even further out levels of abstraction in a way that's still interesting. And so that's, I guess, maybe the biggest provocation I'll take from this is to try to, think more at that level.
Oh, shucks. I do feel this is too much compliments now, Jordan.
All right. Well, let's get some more critiques. Okay. So your grandfather was in the PLA during the China-Vietnam War, and one of his jobs, and he was a propaganda officer, and his job was dropping leaflets on Vietnamese troops, urging them to resist. That in retrospect sounded laughable because these guys had just fought foreign colonialists for 30 years. What is a leaflet written in shitty Vietnamese going to do to them? But you think books matter?
I think books do matter. I think that maybe books matter a little bit less than they used to. But I feel like even if books are declining in importance, authors are gaining in importance, especially if we are in the age of AI, as we do seem to be. I think that authors are gaining in importance. And maybe some people are just going to be Viet Cong troops trying to resist whatever big idea is going to be threatening to enter their field of vision. But I still think that it is important for us to try to create knowledge. And this is something I admire you for, Jordan, for having gone and maintained ChinaTalk after a rebrand, after having been doing this for quite so long. You've been one of the first China podcasts, right? And to have persisted in all of this in this format that was kind of novel, I think that is admirable as well. And I think that is something that we should applaud you for. And if leaflets are not very good, well, maybe podcasts is the answer. So thank you for taking us there.
So you recently did a show, speaking of podcasts, with Stephen Kotkin. 2 hours is excellent. You guys should all take a listen. He spoke in a kind of misty-eyed way at some point about the idea that the dream of authors is to, you write a book, it's read 1 year from now, read 10 years from now, maybe even, God willing, read 50 years from now. I did find it ironic that you both brought up The Power Broker with him as well as had this whole nice riff in your book about the power broker having like soured the minds of a generation of Democratic politicians. So I don't know. Square the circle for me, Dan.
Well, such is the power of books. Now, I think no one would describe the power broker as a mere leaflet, which is what I've written with Breakneck. But the power broker has certainly had tremendous influence. The power broker is one of several books that we can pinpoint as having created the Lawyerly Society. By Robert Caro. This is a monumental work that is called Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. And aside from The Power Broker, we can probably name Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which is about pesticide use in the United States. There's also Jane Jacobs, The Life and Death of American Cities. And maybe we can toss in The Population Bomb by the Ehrlichs here as well. And I think these 4 works were very important in confronting the mistakes of the American Engineering Society throughout the 1950s, which sprayed too much pesticides, which rammed highways across too many urban neighborhoods, which had exhausted itself with these gigantic land wars in Asia. And I think it presented a very useful corrective. And so, if we doubt the power of books, well, let's take a look at The Power Broker, which indeed just celebrated its 50th anniversary here. Now, I certainly don't have any aspirations that Breakneck would be read 50 years from now. I don't have many aspirations that would be read 1 year from now. But I think to have just a little bit more to work with, to think about, I think it is going to be always important to have a sense of mutual curiosity. I think it is always going to be important to have a sense of mutual curiosity between the US and China. And, even if we can get people interested for just 1 year, I think that is very well worth doing.
So you brought us to America. I want to come back to this idea of pluralism that you brought up. I was having a conversation at some very fancy China meetup.
Is there any other kind?
Which was like mostly white people, because of course. One of these said white people had lived in Shanghai for a very long time, had become very wealthy, was an investor, ChinaTalk listener, and he goes, "Jordan, why don't you live in China?" And my response is, "Well, I couldn't do my show in China." And he goes, "But you'd have such a great standard of living. I think you'd be a great McKinsey consultant." He's wrong. I'd be a terrible McKinsey consultant. You could have 3 nurses and 2 house cleaners, and if you just like didn't make any trouble, then you could you could have a really great life there. And reflecting on why I left China, I mean, the proximate reason was COVID. I was outside in the time the country closed. I couldn't get back. But I think the reason why 6 years, which is how long you made it, probably would have been the shelf life for me, if not shorter, is this idea that kind of living in a pluralist society and having the freedom to say what I want and talk to people in an open way who have very divergent opinions is just like core to like what I think living a good life is. What's my question? Is this enough to like win a Cold War? Should we go there? Like, where do you want to go with pluralist society?
Well, I think your attitude towards this former Shanghai resident, I think I probably have the same attitude that this is insufficient for a flourishing society. But let me try to acknowledge that certainly for many people, a life in Shanghai, perhaps another first-tier city in China, and maybe we can throw in Hong Kong here, is desirable because it is very convenient. And this is one of the words that many Chinese bring up, that life is just very fangbian, very convenient to be in one of these big Asian cities. And there is no doubt that life is very fangbian in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, where the subways work very well. There's excellent public order. There's great ways to try out new bars, new restaurants. One could have a nanny from probably Indonesia or the Philippines if you're living in a city like Singapore, The nanny would be from the inland in China, from Anhui, if you're living in Shanghai. And there are many ways in which life in Shanghai, Singapore, Hong Kong, other first-tier China cities is just much more pleasant than in New York, where we're chatting, where the subways are extraordinarily loud, the streets aren't necessarily very orderly and very clean. I think we can accept all of these things. But what we also have in New York, and this is part of the reason that I'm drawn back to the US again, are bookstores. And at these bookstores, one can find books very critical of the US government, very critical of both the Republicans as well as the Democrats, who have both made incredible errors. And for the most part, though there has been some restrictions on protests under Trump's regime in America right now, there still is broad latitude for people to protest all of his illegal or inhumane actions. And that is still very real. Protest culture online is also very real. And what I'm saying is that I just hope that we don't have to choose. I think that the United States should be able to have a relatively, I think the United States can have at its present levels of tolerance of dissent, as well as very functional cities that have good subways, that have good bus systems, that have nice airports, and where people are able to get around and have a rate of improvement that don't come at truly absurd financial costs, because New York in particular has a really hard time building anything. And I don't think why we should have to choose to have bookstores and Port Authority bus terminals that are very well renovated in less than 5 years, which is not within the current project as proposed by Governor Hochul right now. And I think we don't have to choose. And certainly I acknowledge that for many Chinese who move back, they really like having the convenience of their food delivered to them. They get to save quite a lot of money because their rent is not necessarily very, very high. And maybe they really don't care to think so much about politics or philosophy or ideals. But there are also plenty of Chinese who do crave these sort of things. These are creative types. These are journalists. These are feminists. These are people who are interested in ideas. They're really keen to make something of their lives in cities like New York. And I think that is also something that we should welcome here in the United States and allow them to pursue the sort of activity that is borderline impossible in China.
Yeah. You mentioned convenience. You had a whole chapter about when China was the least convenient place in the world. I love this line. I often think about the China Daily headline, "Shanghai has no plans for city lockdown." It could be read in two ways. I first understood it as a denial that the city would impose a lockdown. I understand it now as a totally accurate explanation of what happened next. The city had made no plans for confining 25 million people in their homes for 8 weeks.
Yes.
So it's like, the book Breakneck written in 2019 is a much different book than Breakneck written in 2023, 2024. I think particularly because, we had since 1989 really like 10, 20, we really had close to 3 decades of the state not really imposing their lives as long as you were Han in a way which, really, really wrecked what you expected a functioning middle class, convenient urban life to be.
That's one of the scary things about the engineering state, that the capability is always there to make a lot of people's lives go off track in really big ways. Throughout the 1950s, under this earlier, more idealistic era of the pursuit of communism, maybe most of the 1950s was pretty good if you weren't a landlord, if you weren't a kulak. But then that terminated with Mao's Great Famine, in which these quack agronomy techniques, as well as lies to the central government, terminated in a famine that killed perhaps something like 30 or 40 million people. Now, and then again, after we felt that Mao was chastened, he again unleashed the forces of total mayhem to plunge the country into a cultural revolution. And that is perhaps not so much a typical move by engineers. Mao was much more of a poet. He was a romantic. He was a warlord. And that was something that was his answer to bombard the headquarters. The next great trauma that the Communist Party visited was the one-child policy, which was mostly against the rural areas. And then I think you're right. You're good for about something like 3 decades if you didn't mind the steadily worsening repression from Xi Jinping, which closed off a lot of avenues for creative expression as well as dissent, both online as well as offline. Maybe it would have been good if you weren't a Uyghur in Xinjiang, if you weren't a Tibetan in Tibet. And then I think everybody around the country was plunged into this pandemic control, which the apotheosis was Shanghai, which is probably the greatest lockdown ever imposed in the history of humanity, when 25 million people were unable to leave their apartment compounds over the course of 8 to 10, maybe even 12 weeks in the spring of 2022, when the government organized in the early stages no adequate food delivery to many families who went hungry so that the parents could save food for their children. That was about 2 weeks of the Shanghai lockdown, in which the food situation was quite severe. And in the midst of all of this, you have 4 decades of astonishing growth from China, in which the country was growing at a rate of 8 or 9%. And so that was something that created tremendous wealth, that alleviated poverty, that made a lot of Chinese right now feel really good about what the country was able to accomplish. And this is where I really want to try to grapple with both the good aspects as well as the bad aspects of China, in which, yes, it is absolutely the case that the wealth creation here was astonishing, that has been much more impressive than what any other developing country was able to achieve. Namely, India, Indonesia, Brazil have not had the economic takeoff that China enjoyed. That did bring so many people out of misery and poverty. And at the same time, we have more novel forms of political repression that humanity has never seen before. And I think both of these trends are real, and they both have to be acknowledged.
If there's one thing that's missing in the book, it's the Xinjiang chapter. And you do, given that there was a lot of sort of, each chapter has some sort of personal connection or observation from it. Like, I get it. Maybe you just didn't spend a lot of time in Xinjiang. The sort of Yunnan arc, which you portray is this like happy, fun, free place where these, minorities are in the mountains, so they can kind of get away with not actually doing a lockdown. And, the Xinjiang arc there's an engineering story there. There's an engineering of the soul story, which I think is probably even the more dramatic, is an equally dramatic part than the digital authoritarianism arc, is this idea that you can do to the Uyghurs what you kind of did to all the other minorities. It's just basically wave your hand enough and then they stop being minorities anymore. I don't know. Do you want to do your analysis of that? Did it get left on the chopping block? How'd you think about covering that story?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right that I try to cover the stories that I have some personal experience of, something like zero COVID. And you're right that I've never been to Xinjiang. I wish I had the opportunity to go, but it was a little bit challenging because, foreign nationals, I'm a Canadian citizen. I was but as a Canadian citizen, foreign nationals are tracked a little bit more intensively. And so I never quite had the courage to spend a bit of time in Xinjiang, see things for myself. And I was actively discouraged by some folks in Beijing to even attempt the trip. So I try to write about things that I could talk a little bit more knowledgeably about. And there was no other reason that I left off Xinjiang. I wrote a little bit about the treatment of Tibetans, mostly going off of journal articles that I synthesized into the book. But there were plenty of things left on the chopping block. I could have written, and I wish I did, write a little bit more about the movement of the Three Gorges Dam, which is the world's largest power plant and displaced about 1 million people in China's southwest. I could have written a little bit more about all aspects of social and digital control that people in China have to go through. But I also wanted to write a relatively short book. My book is under 300 pages, and I wanted to hear that people criticize that I wrote a book that was too short by, let's say, 100 pages, rather than a book that was too long by 100 or 200 pages. So that's where I chose to land, and that was the side I chose to err on. But certainly if I had the ability to do some reporting, and if I did take a look at this analysis, I would have written much more about the ethno-religious oppression that took place mostly under Xi.
Yeah. You did cram in a lot of good writing. We're back to complimenting Dan again. The Chinese government often resembles a crew of skilled firefighters who douse blazes they themselves ignited. The engineering state can be awfully literal minded. Sometimes it feels like China's leadership is made up entirely of hydraulic engineers who view the economy and society as liquid flows, as if all human activity from mass production to reproduction can be directed, redirected, increased, or blocked with the same ease as turning a series of valves. Oh, you could have stuck the Three Gorges Dam right in there. Damn. Second version, second edition, yes. Which I'm sure we'll get. What's my question? What's the point of good writing? I mean, you could have done this faster, presumably, without having our nice sentences and extended metaphors.
I write for one reason, which is pleasure. And I think that in my daily life, I think that all of us, and I practice this, must attend to our daily pleasures. And I think that is going to be very important. And I don't read that much poetry, although I expect that I want to. But I spend a lot of time thinking about the voluptuous beauty of Italian comic opera. And I take a lot of inspiration from the cadences and the beats of composers like Mozart and Rossini and Bellini and Donizetti and Verdi. And I think there has to be something important about, if you're going to write any sentence at all, why not make it beautiful and readable and full of cadence and full of splendor?
We're going to do a few more. As more Americans retreat into a digital phantasm, Xi will be shepherding Chinese through the physical world to make babies, make steel, and make semiconductors. When Song Jian assured China's leadership that the population trajectories could be as firmly controlled as missile trajectories, they listened. Skeptics of a one-child policy were making population projections with the aid of an abacus or a handheld calculator. Song Jian presented his group's projections in precise, machine-generated lines on graph paper. Other groups drew uneven squiggles by hand. It wasn't even a fair fight.
What does beauty mean to you, Jordan? How do you practice it? How do you try to enact it in your interviews, in your podcasting, in your writing?
I don't know. I feel really sloppy, and I guess I'm kind of okay with that. It's not a thing that I spend a lot of time cultivating. I go for fast as opposed to, considered and edited. We're going to have like 200 plus newsletters this year. That means I'm not laboring over every sentence. Every once in a while I do. And then I am like, oh wait, but if I do this, the output changes. And it won't be as much. And I think like the subtext, like the psychological undercurrent of the reason I do so many shows and I write so fast and so quickly is to just like quiet my brain, and I'm like scared of silence and like the contemplation that is necessary to do something this or maybe there's just too much ADD to do writing like this. But yeah, I should give it a shot. Maybe every Thursday, slow down and try to actually write something really worth reading.
Well, sometimes it is really important, Jordan, to have a pause.
Xi Jinping, 60% right. Derek Tonsman says that Trump is a great assignment editor. Is it too early to give him a percentage? Because I do feel like a fair amount of the stuff he's gesturing towards are adjacent to the critique of this lawyerly society. I mean, he's like kind of like Nietzschean, like beyond law in a certain profound sense, right?
Yeah, well, I call Xi Jinping 60% correct on everything for two reasons. Because a lot of Xi's motivations on trying to, say, restrain the debt of property developers or to take a look at some of the anti-competitive behaviors of internet companies in China, I think these are completely valid and well-reasoned out motivations. It's just that often the solution, Beijing's solution, is often worse than whatever scary problem that China has. And I also assign Xi to be 60% correct on everything, in part because Deng Xiaoping assigned Mao Zedong to be 70% correct on everything. And I think Xi would be the last person to put up his hand to say that he is the better of Chairman Mao in anything. So I think 60% correct for Xi is
But 70
pretty
is
good.
high for Mao.
Well, that is the
think.
official verdict of history, Jordan.
Okay, but
So,
what's your number for Mao?
Mao was probably, I would say, let's put it 30% correct.
Yeah.
I think that might be the right projection. For Trump, it's a little bit too early to say.
Okay.
I think we need to have Trump move on from perhaps this world before his successors can really assess his legacy and maybe give him something like 70% correct in most of the things he did. Perhaps we'll have that.
All right.
Who's going to be the Deng Xiaoping of America, Jordan?
Amy Klobuchar?
Okay, maybe.
Probably not. I don't know. Jake Paul? There's no one, man. It's 2020 is going to be. I departed the country with a better appreciation of the self-limiting features of the Chinese system. Most notably, the Communist Party distrusts and fears the Chinese people, limiting their potential for flourishing. So if you want to make the inverse of the argument that I made at the very beginning of this, is that if we're presuming a party to still be there, and we're presuming that that party is still going to have internalized the lessons of Gorbachev, who I think did probably not trust, didn't fear the Soviet people nearly as much as maybe he should have if he wanted to keep the party going literally and figuratively. That I think is a constant you can draw through. Not just the post-Mao folks, but really everyone, and even the Huyabangs and the Zhaoziyangs, like the most liberal folks that we've seen. I think they still distrust and feared the people at some sort of elemental level, and to imagine a Chinese leader coming up through the party system who doesn't have that kind of in their core is a hard thing for me to project forward.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And maybe the Chinese are taking a look at the United States and saying, well, in 2016, maybe the American elites should have feared their people a little bit more, and they didn't have quite enough fear there. That's certainly a possibility. I think that, yes, it is going to be the case that the Chinese are never going to fully trust their people, or maybe even not trust them very much at all. And I think this is one of the reasons that China will not have a flourishing liberal society by any stretch of the imagination. If the Communist Party goes away, I think we would still have a party. Let's say if the Nationalists won before they were ejected out to Taiwan in 1949. If the Nationalists won, we would still have a country that is nursing its grievances over imperialist incursions in the past, that would still be very intent on achieving some degree of technological primacy over the rest of the world. And I think that they are probably not going to be trusting their people very extensively as well. And I hope that China could develop a regime that does trust its people much more so than the they do now, because the Chinese people are such a lovable folk. Don't you agree, Jordan? That I think they can be extremely creative. Their memes are no less than what American superpower 20-year-olds and 14-year-olds are able to produce online. There's so much wordplay with the Chinese language. There's a lot of jokiness throughout China. I think that Chinese are very funny. I think people in Yunnan are very funny, which is my heritage. I think that people in Beijing are very funny. The people in Shanghai, maybe not so funny, but most people everywhere else can be very, very funny. And I wish that the regime could recognize that it has a lot of people who have wonderful creative spirits, who are going to have great memes all day long. They're going to create wonderful pieces of artwork and literature and all sorts of great shows, great movies. If they had that opportunity, they would have all sorts of wonderful jokes that they could play on us. And I'm really optimistic that the spirit of the Chinese teenager is indomitable, just as the spirit of the American teenager is completely indomitable. It's only that one of them is very actively suppressed by the state and the other is not.
The one line I disagree with was you say, I miss the ambient friendliness of Americans, as if you didn't get that in China, at least in good chunks of it. At least, I moved through the country in a different way than you did with my face, but I think it still was, that's one of the things that will never leave me. And I think you sort of mentioned it at a different point in the book, talking about why this is the destination of choice for so many Chinese. And it's not just because it's rich and it's the land of opportunity or whatever, but the kind of cultural overlaps in terms of, entrepreneurship and like ease of engagement with other folks are really profound.
Well, I would say that you do have a good face, Jordan. I wouldn't try to sell it short. And I have a different face, and not all of us can be so blessed. But certainly there is an ambient, let's call it friendliness is in the mix of being in China. But there can be also an ambient, I'm going to get in your face about your business sense. There is sometimes an ambient aggressiveness and shoviness sense in China, as there is in the US as well. I guess this is a little bit more stark to me because I spent some time in Europe. I just traveled to Europe for 2 months, and we were mostly in Denmark. And one of these things that we hear about Danish folks is that they have a really hard time making friends after high school. You would have your friends you make in elementary school. You would have some friends you make in university, maybe some friends you made when you were traveling to the United States. But after that, people have enough friends. They're good. People travel around in roving packs to the bar, and then they don't really socialize with the other roving packs at the Danish bar. And it's just much easier to have a conversation with someone on the bus in New York, on the street in New York, walking around, and they don't get up so much in your business. And I think you're right that it's absolutely the case that there is a lot of ambient friendliness in China, and that is one of these things I really enjoy about the place. But there is also the turn of that coin is that they can really get up in your business. And how often are you asked, as soon as you meet a new Chinese person, are you married? How many children do you have? What's your salary? And sometimes I don't really feel like answering those questions. It's a bit odd.
Yeah. I mean, I think the ambient anxiety as well is something which is very different in the US, where even, you have these think pieces about how people can't afford the rent and life is terrible, but it's like, I don't know. I think it's not a nationally defining thing in the US, the sort of like, modern anxieties in the way that I think it is in China.
Yeah, this is certainly one of the many reasons I am glad that I did not grow up in China, especially not as a woman, is that the pressure that women face in China is completely insane. I think that it is not only workplace stuff, and in the workplace, I think you and I both know that Chinese women are many of the most capable people. They do most of the work. Now, often they are the most efficient people in every organization, and they are consistently passed over for leadership because they are not a guy. And so China really doesn't treat women very well, I think, in the workplace. And then imagine the sort of pressure that you face once you are seeing your neighbors, or even worse, your family, over the most important Chinese holiday, over Lunar New Year. Every woman is asked one question: are you married yet? To the single, and when will you have children? To the married. And it feels like unless a woman has not produced at least one child and at least one son, then she will not have broader respect within the family. And I think the Chinese women are consistently the most undervalued people, and they are the ones that should be elevated the most. This is in part because they face far too many pressures. And generally, China is just kind of this high pressure society where one does need a little bit of shoviness in order to get ahead. And that sometimes can be pretty wearying once you've spent enough time in China, because the shoviness is not really wonderful. The overworked aspects of a lot of people, 996 is real for a segment of the population who work from 9 to 9, 6 days a week. And then they go home and face a lot of family pressures. And then many people don't have an easy time of being able to afford their apartments in Shanghai or Beijing. It is kind of a high pressure environment. And that is also one of these things that, you come to the US, you're left alone. You go to Florida or Texas and people aggressively leave you alone. And that is one of these things I kind of crave after being over there for a while.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of pushiness of both the one child policy stuff and now the party telling you need to have more kids is just like, you have a number of these Orwellian flips, which you document in modern society. That's one of them. And then the other, of course, of COVID being this thing that would kill you and is worth, not getting your cancer treatment in order to prevent, to, oh, it's a flu. And by the way, you don't even need ibuprofen to get through, much less a vaccine, much less a Moderna vaccine. It's just, you see echoes of it in the US sometimes where like Trump says, oh, don't care about Epstein anymore.
Right.
But it doesn't work really to just all that much to like completely turn on a gravity distortion field and just say, when you were saying A is A one day, to say B is A the next day. And that's another benefit of a pluralist society, to have people, to have noise that pushes back on that sort of thing.
Well, this is what engineers do. They tell you for a while, you must not have more than one child, to you really should have 3 children. And, to hear that COVID is this life-threatening thing and it is our national duty to prevent any transmissions from, to, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And this is how engineers treat society, that it is, they swerve really suddenly every so often. And at some point that is going to give people very severe whiplash.
Beijing has been taking the future dead seriously for the past 4 decades. That is why they will not outcompete the US. What a line.
I think that the country that will outperform in the world has a sense of humor. And Beijing has the least sense of humor out of all of them, at least official Beijing. Unofficial Beijing is very humorous. But one of my favorite recent little pieces as a gag is that Alex Boyd, who is part of Asia Society, translated and found this page of official jokes. Have you seen this from Xi Jinping?
Yeah, Alex Boyd, former ChinaTalk intern. How could we not? We're running this next week.
That is, you can read some of these jokes from Xi Jinping himself, and you can decide how many of them are very funny. I think this is not, humor with Xi characteristics is not really going to pull us out of our feet. And I prefer the superpower that isn't taking this future with such seriousness, because by taking the future with such seriousness, this is one of the great insights from Stephen Kotkin, that there is this kind of apocalyptic sense in communist systems. You liberalize a little bit, you slip out a little bit, and somehow the entire system will collapse. And every day is an apocalyptic life or death struggle for the Communist Party. And that sort of system is going to end up being fairly brittle. I think that's my view.
Engineers don't know how to persuade. The Communist Party insists on a history in which the party is always correct and where all errors come from traitors or foreigners. Rather than acknowledge fault and tell persuasive stories, the instinct of the engineering state is simply to censor alternative narratives. Xi comes off as someone who is a little bit too eager for groveling respect from the rest of the world, which is exactly why he'll never get it.
Yes.
Kotkin, the other little Kotkin-y moment in there, which you highlighted, is this idea that Li Qiang, who was the mayor of Shanghai, initially was one of the people who was trying to keep his city more open. But once it came down to it and he got the order, he does the biggest lockdown in human history. He is the most reviled politician in all of the local politician in all of the country, and he gets the biggest promotion anyone can get, to be premier. And it's such a reminder that, yeah, sure, it's a country where at some level people are promoted on performance, but once you get up to the top rungs of power, it's not that, it's loyalty. And this man delivered on what he was told to do, even when it came at what would be considerable political cost in a democratic society. And I don't know, this is still a crazy system we're dealing with. Like, that is not political logic. You make the point that basically every party in the world who was in charge of COVID lost votes after COVID ended because people were upset about the time in their life. But to have the emblem of bad Omicron era COVID policy now be something that be a person that people are going to have on their TV for the next 5 years, this is a remarkable thing.
Yeah, well, maybe he's going to be squeezed out of TV because he seems to be a remarkably weak premier by the standards of Chinese premiers. And you're absolutely right that in every pandemic country, the ruling party lost vote shares, and it is only in China that the most hated emblem of the zero COVID restrictions gets promoted up to the top, the highest that any other politician could go under Xi.
Yeah.
And I wonder
the idea that Kamala would have Fauci as her running mate.
Yes,
is basically what we're talking about.
Yes, that would be quite a thing, wouldn't it? And I think this surely degrades and erodes some of the competence of other people inside the Politburo and inside the Central Committee, because there were plenty of people who perhaps administered their city more effectively with the pandemic control policies. Now, I think one could debate how effective Li Qiang was. One could say that Li Qiang did his best in trying to resist a very fierce lockdown. And then when that shifted, he was kind of in charge with another vice premier in implementing that lockdown. And maybe he simply followed orders and did the best job that he could. But certainly, I think I wouldn't have expected after the Shanghai lockdown that Li Qiang, who was one of Xi's proteges, would be promoted to anything as high as one of the 4 vice premiers within the Chinese system. In fact, for him to be premier, I think must surely have bred considerable resentment within his peers, who took a look at what an awful job perhaps he did. And again, you can maybe debate that, but Li Qiang has certainly created a lot of misery. And then for them to see this guy vault over them in terms of the party hierarchy, that cannot feel really good for other cadres.
So we've got Rickover, Moses, and Eisenhower as Americans you're shouting out, all perhaps peaked in the 1950s or early 1960s, all products of a Cold War America. I mean, I guess, Moses was doing his thing even in the 30s, but I think there is a narrative which maybe was a little more prominent in American politics a year or two ago, that Cold War framing is the thing that is going to get the U.S. out of its engineering rut. And we will do big things because now we have another, and we'll break a lot of eggs and like build amazing stuff again because we have a new replacement for the Soviet Union. You're still hopeful though that we can get there, even if this is not the kind of defining framework for America for the next few decades.
I certainly don't hope that we repeat all of the mistakes of the last Cold War, which wasn't very cold for Vietnam, which wasn't very cold for Laos, and which wasn't very cold for Afghanistan. The US and the Soviet Union made these tremendous mistakes and inflicted a lot of horrors on foreign populations as well as somewhat on their own populations in the course of pursuing the Cold War. And so I am reluctant to say that the U.S. should desire or embrace anything like a Cold War, given how the last Cold War went. I am hopeful that the U.S. will be able to recover some of its engineering chops because it's become tremendously obvious that the U.S. needs to do this without even any framing of China as the great adversary. We're in New York right now. Affordable housing is a very big issue. New York can't build subways at less than $2 billion per mile, which is just so far above European levels of construction. U.S. can't fix Port Authority bus terminal in under 5 years. And this is to say nothing of Massachusetts or California, which have really bad construction issues. None of that have to implicate China. That is purely an American lawyerly society problem. We have movements like the Abundance Agenda that is trying to make sure that U.S. big cities are able to build quite a lot more. And there is broad complaint within both the American left and right that the U.S. manufacturing base has rusted top to bottom, in which apex manufacturers like Intel and Boeing have just an unbroken tale of woe. If we take a look at any of their headlines, that the U.S. manufacturing base wasn't able to produce anything as simple as masks and cotton swabs in the early days of the pandemic. That was also pathetic. And we also have a defense industrial base that has pretty significantly rusted with the U.S. unable to produce a lot of munitions or naval ships on time. And so I think, maybe the defense industrial base has to implicate China, but really that implicates a lot of already existing problems, as well as the war in Ukraine, which took a lot of munitions from the United States. But I think the U.S. needs to fix its own problems, not to be able to confront China, but because it has been doing pretty badly itself. And I think the same goes for China, that the contest will not go to the country that builds a bigger rocket or more homes. I think the contest will be won by the country that is able to deliver better for its own citizens. And I think that is ultimately where both countries really need to get to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. The question is like, if we need a fundamental rethink and quote unquote Cold War framing from 2020 to 2024 didn't get us there, like is Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein and Dan Wang evangelizing enough to sort of have like this? I mean, I'm reaching for another analogy, like our Sputnik moment 2.0, which not only does the international stuff, but also gets you the interstate highway system and the equivalent of that for what we need today. That's our only data point, right? Yes. Or maybe we can go back further in history.
But I also am unsure that the Cold War framing will work because right now, as we're speaking with each other at the end of August 2025, President Trump seems to be the most pro-China member of the White House. And he doesn't seem to be terribly interested in a Cold War. When a reporter asked him whether he should have welcomed more Chinese students to the United States, he responded, "It's our honor to have them." And he's right. And I think the U.S. should be attracting more students from China as well as from all nations. And I think that is not going to work if the commander-in-chief is uninterested in having a Cold War. We've tried to impose this Cold War framing for a little while, and I think that hasn't worked, at least so far. Maybe we will get there in some other way. But I don't think that there is a single knockdown argument that is going to have the U.S. recover some of its engineering chops. I think there needs to be many types of arguments, and the worse that the situation becomes, then the more that the U.S. needs to do.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Gallagher had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal basically saying we should dramatically tighten immigration policy from China. You have a USCIS head saying that F1 visa holders should understand that, in fact, they're not welcome after here, and OPT maybe is a thing that's going the way of the dodo bird. We'll see how it plays out. It's clear that Trump is not entirely on board with this, but I wonder if Xi is going to do something like a more dramatic version of a balloon, which doesn't necessarily have to be an invasion of Taiwan, that kind of clicks, that lets the Cold War framing, gives the Cold War framing a second, a second breath of fresh air. But
maybe,
I don't know.
Maybe, but I suspect that Xi has studied his history and is really reluctant to give an excuse to the Americans to engage in another Cold War. And even the balloon seemed like it might have been an accident in which the leadership didn't know about it. And we can deal with balloons, Jordan. We can deal with balloons all day.
Yeah, but can we deal with 50 Filipinos dying or something? Probably. We'll see. It's, again, as Kotkin says, history's full of, the one thing we know about history is it's full of surprises. So yes. TBD. On the Cold War stuff, when I had you and Ezra and Derek, I think you put to me, if the U.S. should, have a goal of constraining Chinese growth. Do you have an answer to that question, or like how would you? What's our policy optimization function when thinking about?
Well, I asked you the question, Jordan. What's the answer? You've had several months to think about it.
I don't have a book coming out, Dan. Come on.
I think that the U.S. should not be seen as in a position to be constraining China's growth. And I think it would be disastrous for the U.S. if the Chinese earnestly believe that the U.S. government was trying to hold down China's innovation prospects or economic growth prospects, because that would seem very dramatically unfair. Now, there are some people in Beijing that already do believe in some version of this, but I think that is not necessarily consensus. And I think it is important for the US government to communicate that it wants a good future for Chinese people everywhere. And I think that there's nothing that Trump would lose by saying that he wishes that the people of China can be rich, well-off, and happy.
Let's close with some book recommendations. I don't know. Why'd read the Bible? Steinhall, someone you recommended to me the other day.
Book of
name
Exodus.
I'm saying wrong. Okay, just Exodus.
Book of Exodus, Jordan. That's where it's at. Maybe bested by the book of Genesis. But, the 5 books of the Torah, I think that is something really important here.
So, but prophets and writings we're just shrugging off?
Well, Ecclesiastes is very beautiful, and as Robert Alter translates, the chapter is called Kohelet. And I think there certainly is a great deal of beauty in the Song of Songs and in the dreariness, frankly, of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet. And I think something that is important for us all to keep in mind is that the heart of the wise dwell in the house of mourning, while it is the heart of fools that dwells in the house of mirth.
And we're going to end on that. Dan Wang, thank you so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Thank you very much, Jordan.
Oh yeah, Dan, what's our song?
I think there is no music more sublime than the ending of The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart, in which the Count asks and begs for forgiveness from the Countess for all of his incredible indiscretions, and then the entire cast joins him in a song of perfect grace.